Thanks for tuning in. This is your host, Yoshino. You're listening to Artist Decoded. This episode is with Elly Smallwood, who is a painter. We've had her on the podcast a couple times in the past, and she's just such a pleasure to talk to and catch up with. I love being able to riff with her, and we went down a lot of various rabbit holes. We talked a bit about her moving to the woods from living in Toronto and then Ottawa for a long time. A subject came up about seeking balance between living a peaceful life while simultaneously wanting to seek progression in one's career. Elly was just very honest and open throughout this entire episode of her process, her thoughts, the way that she puts together her artwork and the ideas around it. We even talked about tarot a bit, which is a favorite subject of mine as of recently. We also talked about Elly's bone collection, which is kind of funny, but you'll have to wait to hear about that. And I just want to say that I apologize because I haven't been actively posting episodes with the frequency that I did before. That will change. It's just that I've been really focused on a particular project that I can't wait to announce with you all eventually, but I kind of have to keep it under wraps for now. And so that'll change. I'm still going to be posting a lot of episodes. It's just recently I've been busy. And I've also been traveling. Perhaps I'll talk about this on another podcast, but I'm essentially living a completely nomadic lifestyle now. And I'm currently in Mexico City. And yeah, it's exciting. It's different. Perhaps I'll do a single episode just talking about that at some point, if people are interested. And yeah, so I had a really great conversation with Elly Smallwood. Please do check her artwork out when you can. You can go to elly.ca, which is her website, or you can find her on Instagram at instagram.com/Elly Smallwood. Before we begin this episode, please go to our iTunes and Spotify page. And I know I've said this before, but it would be greatly beneficial for us at the podcast to get as many reviews as possible. So if you can do that, take a couple seconds or even a minute out of your day just to do that. That would really help out the podcast and help me out as well. So here it is, my conversation with Elly Smallwood. Hope you all enjoy it, and thanks for tuning in. Yeah, so thanks for joining me. And, it's been a while since we last spoke, aside from speaking on the phone the other day, but it was good to take that time to be able to catch up with you.
Yeah, it's nice catching up with you again. It's been a long time. It's been a while. I feel like the world has changed a lot, but yeah, it's good to talk again.
Totally. Yeah. I think the last podcast that I put out with you was in 2018. I believe it was 2018. And I know since then, since the the beginning stage of the pandemic, you moved to the woods, and you were living in Toronto prior to that. Is that correct?
Yeah, I was living in Toronto for 11 years, I think. So that was I feel like a lot of people still associate me with being from Toronto because I was very kind of like publicly in the Toronto art scene. I was always posting about being in Toronto. But about 5 years ago, maybe 5 or 6 years ago, I moved to Ottawa. And then now I'm just living in the woods kind of close to Ottawa.
Okay, that makes sense. And so can you tell me a bit about the transition from living in the city to being more secluded and even the difference between being more in the woods as opposed to, being in Ottawa, for instance, like the different modalities of living in these different places.
Hmm. Well,
Yeah.
it felt like it was never really because when I first came up here to the woods, I was like, well, we have this 2 week quarantine, and there's no way that this whole pandemic thing is going to go longer than 2 weeks. So why not just go to the woods for 2 weeks, and then this will all blow over and I can just go back to the city and everything will be back to normal.
Yeah.
So it was supposed to only be for 2 weeks, and then it just kept kind of getting pushed longer and longer. And I kept thinking, well, it's perfect here and I love being here. And as soon as this is all over, I'll go back to the city. But, as time has gone on, like as soon as I came up here to the woods, it just felt right. It felt like home. I just connect with everything so much more than I do in the city. Like I feel like I didn't even realize how the city was affecting me until I came out here. And then now when I go back to the city, it's like there's constant sounds and there's constant noises and smells and just things happening all the time. And it's like, it feels to me almost like your nervous system is just constantly kind of like on edge a little bit because there's just so much happening at all times. You have to constantly be kind of aware of all this stuff. And you go into the woods and there's like a million smells, but they're all so subtle and like different. And there's like one of the things I think we might have talked about this a bit, but I love like foraging for mushrooms. And one of the things that I found so difficult at the beginning was like your eyes don't really pick up on them. And I think that's because in the city you get so used to, like when you look around, there's so many things. There's little pieces of plastic, there's garbage, there's styrofoam cups like all over the ground. So your eyes just kind of learn how to like tune out all those little things. And then when you get used to living in the woods, it's like you relearn how to see and hear and smell. And you get used to this kind of like now if I see like a white shape on the forest floor, I'm like, ooh, mushroom. And, any kind of like tiny little shapes, I'm like, ooh, this is something, this must be something. And you go back into the city and it's like, you just feel overwhelmed because there's stuff everywhere. There's things everywhere. So it just kind of from like a personal sense, I just feel like being in the woods, it was like, I didn't even realize that I didn't really feel like myself when I was in the city until I got used to living in the woods and I felt like myself again. And I think for art as well, like it just comes so much more naturally when you don't have so many distractions around you.
Did you grow up going to the woods a lot, like when you were in your adolescence?
Yeah. So I'm living in a cabin in the woods now that's owned by like my family. And growing up, we would always come here. And so now I just came back up here, but this is kind of partly where I grew up. So I guess it kind of feels like home as well because of that. And I think like being in the woods and be able to like navigate in the woods and survive in the woods has always kind of been a part of my life. So that always felt very like natural. And I think that even if you didn't grow up in the woods, I think for most people, like you kind of revert back to that pretty easily.
You revert back to what, this connection with nature? Or
yeah, I think, I mean, in different ways for everyone, but I think, a lot of my friends have said that they're like, oh, well, I would never go into the woods. Like, I don't know how to be in the woods. I don't know like where to go or what to do or anything. And then, as they spend more time out there, as they get more used to it, like it's like a skill, a practice, like anything else. But I think it's one that comes pretty naturally to most people. Like when you're outside for long periods of time, you just kind of get used to like living in a slightly different way.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think it's really interesting how adaptable we are as creatures, but I think a lot of the times we allow ourselves to dictate our actions by fear as opposed to doing something that could potentially be a little bit more challenging. I mean, I think it could be equally challenging to go from the woods to going to the city and going to the city into the woods. I think it's just a different polarity of how challenging it can be, and I think, I can only speak for my experiences in the city, but if you think about the energy, it's just like energy in general and what attracts people to the energy of wanting to be in a city, I believe it would be more so for capitalistic, opportunistic purposes as opposed to something that is more, I suppose, grounded in nature and those sort of subtleties,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
and, and there's benefits of, I think there's benefits of both, but for me personally, I would say that being more grounded just feels better. It just feels right. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And in terms of like there being benefits in both, like I would say the community aspect is probably like the biggest thing about cities that I love, is that when you are back in the city, like there is that kind of wonderful feeling of being like surrounded by people and that kind of like connection to other people. So I feel like for me, the ideal would be the kind of combination of the two, like having that community feeling of being like, this is like, there's a support network that you can rely on and other people that you can like share your like love and passion for things with, but then also having like more of that connection and space and peace and quiet with like nature. Cause it does feel like, and I feel like there's a lot of kind of maybe psychological like buzzwords that people throw around a lot, but it kind of feels like your nervous system is like constantly like activated when you're in the city. Like you're kind of always like, I feel at least always kind of like aware and anxious and like this like low level stress all the time. And definitely also that kind of, like you're saying, like capitalistic drive to like constantly be working like every minute of the day. Like very much for me when I was in Toronto, I was all about that like hustle culture, like work. I was so proud of like how many all-nighters I could pull and how many hours I could work. And like the more burnt out I felt, the better it was, because I was like, this is a sign that I'm working so hard. I'm getting so much done. And I'm trying to get away from that more now, but it's so hard. It's just so like deep wired into you. And I feel like the only time I truly feel free of that is like when I'm in the woods and I'm like, no, this is enough. There doesn't need to be anything more.
Yeah. Yeah. I think, those decisions that we make, for, as an example, like, going to the city and making that decision. I mean, we're essentially adapting ourselves to survive in that extent of living in a city, which requires more monetary resources than living in the woods, for instance. And I think like, I don't know. I think about that quite a bit. I think about also just this, what I want to call like a post intellectualization. What I mean by that is being able to utilize, books and different philosophies and different teachings and stuff, to the degree in which it helps you, but at the same time being able to really feel and understand like how that applies to your life. I think about like philosophers like Nietzsche and Wittgenstein and like a couple of these different quote unquote like great minds that like drove themselves to insanity. And I think like, how do you find kind of like the balance of the Buddhist monk and the intellectualization of being a philosopher in a sense, if that makes any sense?
Yeah, well, I feel like there is so much, and I guess like the internet kind of, I think it exacerbates everything. Because there is that constant, almost like it feels like there's this constant draw of people or push, I guess, of people looking so hard to find like what is the meaning, like, or maybe looking for like a god or a guru to show them like what is the meaning, tell me what to do, what is the pathway, what is the right thing. And you see so many people who find like, okay, this is my thing right now. It's a diet, or it's a philosophy, or it's a self-help book, or whatever it is, and they're like, this has to have all the answers, and they kind of throw everything into that. And then on the other side, there's all these people trying to be the next god or guru or whatever it is, and trying to be like, this is the answer to all of your problems, this is it, like if you just do this one thing, if you just follow this 5 tips, if you just subscribe to my Patreon, I'm going to share the 10 secrets of life to like so you'll be completely happy and you'll never question what your meaning in this world is again. It's
I love
like,
that.
you get sucked into it too, because I'm such a person who like kind of picks up little bits and pieces from everywhere and is kind of always being like, ooh, like, how do I feel about this idea? How do I feel about that idea? But at the end of the day, like, I think we're all kind of like almost searching for that, like someone to just tell us, like, just tell me what to do so I can be happy and be fine and everything will be good. And it's like, yeah, I guess maybe that's like the internet, I definitely think kind of makes that like more obvious. But I guess that's what humans have been doing throughout all of time. You know,
Oh yeah.
that's what philosophers, that's how philosophers came into existence, kind of trying to find those answers.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, a book that kind of comes to mind is this book called The Richest Man in Babylon. And essentially, I might botch this story a little bit, but there's like one advisor in the book, and that advisor is saying like, oh, I know how to, make everyone rich and, follow me. And essentially that person was also, I suppose you can call it like a blind prophet as well. Like he was someone that was just as lost as other people, but was utilizing or manipulating the situation in order to have people follow him, and I think that, that book is, I forget exactly how old that book is, but I think that's, deeply embedded within human psychology, is this idea of power and power dynamics and manipulating of situations in order to play it better for your favor and that sort of a thing. And I think that, especially when it comes to modern day philosophical teachers or quote unquote prophets, I think we have to understand like what those people are trying to sell, what ideas are trying to be sold. And and that's not to say that some of these people don't have like good philosophies to follow by, but I'm a high believer in like not following dogmatic principles, so like even there's all kinds of books that have lots of really solid philosophies, but if it's taught by people, it's going to be flawed. So I think take it with a grain of salt,
Yeah, well, I think it's like no one wants a complex or gray area answer, They want one simple rule. It's like, here's the one thing that you need to remember, and it's going to be the answer to every single situation you're in. No one wants kind of something that's messier or more complex, because then it's like you're going to have to figure it out in every situation what the right answer is.
And life is messy and life is complex, So like, I think by following a dogmatic principle to tell you that, these are the commandments to follow, or, I think like can be very problematic, because I think it's very hard and very unsettling for people to believe in the ideology that life has no meaning.
Yeah, that we're like, as much as an ant has meaning, we have the same amount of meaning to our lives. It's literally just, we get this one little blip of existence, and you get to choose in every moment whether or not you're going to enjoy that.
Yeah.
But there's no greater purpose. There's no end goal. There's no set of rules that you need to follow. And that's very, it's freeing, but it's also very like, it's like looking into the abyss. It's like kind of hard for your brain to really wrap itself around.
Yeah.
So you were talking about like how so much of it is kind of manipulation and the power dynamics and stuff. And I think that that's so true. And it's so interesting because with so many, the idea of kind of like gurus, but it's also applicable to art. Like so much of it is, can you convince people that this is good enough, that it's worthwhile, that it's valuable? I have a group of artists that I paint with online every week. And one of the things that we're always like talking about is how you need to have like the confidence of a cult leaders to sell your art, because cult leaders with absolutely no qualifications whatsoever can get all these people to not just follow them but die for them. And I'm like, if Jim Jones can do it, you can convince someone to buy your art for $1,000. Like, You just need to have Jim Jones's confidence.
Oh man. That's I'm like, I don't know exactly how to respond to that, you know, because there's like certain moral like things that I think of when I think about like cult leaders. For instance, a lot of people bring up Osho quotes to me,
Mm-hmm.
and in just random conversations, and in the back of my head, and sometimes, you know, I say something, and other times I just kind of like let it pass, and I'm just like, okay, well, you probably haven't seen Wild Wild Country, have you? You know,
Mm-hmm.
like,
I think like it's interesting seeing how like so much of your value and worth in our society currently is just determined by how much you think you're worth. So I think in the art world, more than anywhere else, so much of it kind of comes down to like confidence and selling yourself and your own belief in your own worth and value, which is so funny because like artists as a group tend to be very like not very confident people and not very sure of their worth or value. And it's funny that so much of like how much is your art worth is just like, well, how much do you think it's worth? Like, how valuable do you think your own art is?
yeah, I think that's a really good and helpful conversation to have for a lot of people that are trying to figure out how to value their artwork. Like, is that something that you learned early on, to value your artwork at like a higher price? I mean, and also I think what we're trying to tie in is, you know, how much you value your artwork is really how much you define the value for yourself in this capacity, because the money will allow you to continue your art. And yeah.
I mean, I haven't learned that yet. I'm gonna learn how to appropriately value myself and my art one day. I'm not there yet. I'm the work. It's funny because I am constantly talking to people about how they need to value their art higher, how they need to have more confidence and self worth in their art. But I'm such a hypocrite because I am the worst at that. I chronically undervalue my art. I'm so bad. I was talking with some art friends about how hard it is to like even just like when someone's interested in your work, just telling them the price or like asking them for the money and that you like tell them the price and you're kind of like, oh my God, you know, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry to even like ask you for my, you like, why don't you just take my work for free? Like my art valueless. How dare I be so bold as to ask for money? Like, it's like all of us have this like constant feeling that it's so unreasonable for us to have high prices or even just very moderate to low prices. Like we always feel like it's so unreasonable. And it's such a hard feeling to get over. And I'm so bad at it, even though I'd like to think that I love my art and it's, you know, it's how I exist and how I survive in this world. And I do want to value it more highly, but it's hard, particularly when it comes down to like monetary value for things, because I'm very much someone who's not big on money and has never cared much a lot like about money as a concept or having a ton of money. Like I've just always been like, I wish that that didn't exist. And so it's kind of hard for me to be like, oh, I'm going to put a ton of effort into like, you know, increasing my prices and making money off of this. But at the same time, I'm like, I need to exist in this world somehow.
Totally. Yeah. I think, yeah, it's interesting how there's this, you know, because the art market, well, I mean, I'm like, do I even want to talk about the art market? All right. So here, this is what I'll say. This is what I'll say. I think like, this is my question to you. So what do you think, or where do you think the cognitive dissonance comes from within you psychologically? And like, how do you think that is something that you can personally overcome?
Well, I think for me, it's like, what do I want in this world? I want to be a tiny little frog who lives underneath a leaf while it's raining, and I have a little mug of tea, and you know, I'm just like tiny. I want like little wood fire stoves. I want to be foraging for mushrooms. I want like this like very small and quiet and peaceful life. But at the same time, I feel like I have to participate in this society that I do not like, or not society, but this like structure, this existence that I don't like and I don't agree with and I don't think is morally right, but I also don't know what the solution is. And so there's this constant feeling of like, I don't want to be a part of that world. I don't want to be a part of this like hustle culture. I don't want to be a part of trying to make more and more money and consume more and more things. I just want to live a like smaller, simpler life. But then
Totally.
at the same time, I feel like it's almost like, how can you not participate in that? And is there like um, maybe almost like an abandonment of your duties as a human being existing in the society if you just kind of go to the woods and you say, none of this is my problem. Like, I'm just going to opt out of society and let you guys
Yeah.
all deal with that. Like, it
Hmm.
does kind of feel like it's like that's not the right solution either. But then what is?
Hmm. I understand that. Yeah. I understand the idea of having a disdain for the capitalistic systems and the structures that are in place in order for people to gain rewards in order for them to survive in this life, just as a concept. And yeah, I think that being able to exist within the system without it being your doctrine or it
Mm-hmm.
not being your religion, kind of getting the benefits of it and understanding the way that it functions without taking it personally and without, because I very much relate with you in terms of, I was in Los Angeles for so long, like a majority of
Mm-hmm.
my adult life, and recently have embraced this nomadic lifestyle, living in different parts of Mexico, traveling and doing all of that, and which requires money, but at the same time, like, um, there's certain things that I personally will not do for money, and
Mm-hmm.
perhaps it's kind of like the idea of like having your cake and wanting to eat it too, um, but yeah, I don't know. I think that there's just like, um, it's difficult to associate something that you love, even if it's outside of art, right? Something that you love and needing to sell that thing, like
Yeah,
it's hard to put a price on that, right? It can be complex, right?
it is, yeah. And I've talked, like, so many artists have different relationships to it. I have friends who really struggle to sell their art because they're like, I love this painting and I want to keep it forever. Whereas me, as soon as I finish a painting, I'm like, get this out of my set. I never want to look at it again. Every time I look at it, I'm like, oh, why is this still here? Like, someone please take it. So I think it's very, like, we all have different relationships to kind of like the art that we create and what, like, how we want it to go out in the world. Do we want it to stay with us? Do we want it to be like on someone else's wall, grazing someone else's home? And it's
Yeah.
kind of hard when at the end of the day, for me at least, like, it's my business. So it doesn't matter whether or not I feel like I've never had the opportunity to want to keep a painting because I need the money more than I need the painting. So it's never even been an option. And I also, like, I really don't like the way it changes how you make art. That for me, I'm lucky and
Mm.
I make art really quickly, and I always have, and I like constantly have new ideas. And I just like, as soon as I start a painting, I'm like, I already want to finish this so I can start my next one because I'm so excited. Like, I just always want to like be making more and more. But also, like, with the current culture, particularly with like the internet and stuff, there is such a like, I don't want to say content creation, but it kind of starts to feel like everything you do is content creation, and it's like produce more and
Yeah.
more and more. And I feel like I work so quickly and I still don't ever feel like I'm creating enough. Like, it feels like every moment of my day is trying to make something, like produce some kind of product. And it feels like you're always failing, and it's exhausting. And it also like, it makes you hate, and I mean, I've never hated art and I never could, but like, it makes you not love the process of creativity. Like, there's so much joy and excitement there, but when you're doing it because you constantly feel like you have to be creating to be a part of this capitalistic society. I feel like we're saying capitalist too much, but that is kind of at the end of the day what
Yeah.
so much of it comes down to.
Yeah, for sure. No, I understand. Yeah, I think something that I've been thinking about too is just reconciling polarities or reconciling opposites and
Mm.
understanding and being aware of the paradox that exists. So it's like, let me see if I can pull up. I've been talking a lot about the Kabbalion
Mm-hmm.
recently because it's such a profound resource for, I believe, to be vital information. And let's see if I can bring it up in my notes. It's in here somewhere.
I do feel like you said, it's almost the idea like we have to contain multiple opposing ideas within us at the same time. And
Yeah, because
it's hard. It feels like you're constantly containing multitudes, and sometimes it's just too much.
totally, yeah, and I think like, you know, wanting to price your art higher is not a mutually exclusive ideology to like I don't think that necessarily has to take away from the art, you know, and perhaps I feel like, you know, there's reasons why people get managers and stuff that they
Mm-hmm.
trust. I mean, I think that's like, to the outside audience, like I've definitely worked with managers and agents and things that, like, you know, I thought that I trust and then, you know, didn't really work out, or, you know, so I've had those
Mm-hmm.
experiences personally. But I think like the reason why anyone would want, especially like someone like you that constantly produces work and potentially doesn't want to deal with like the business stuff. Like, at least that's what I'm gathering. Is that correct?
Yeah. And well, like you said, like, yeah, I was always someone who did not want to deal with any kind of dealers, managers, even galleries, really. I always just wanted to do everything through myself because I was like, I love the business aspect of it. I want to be involved in anything. And also, no one else is going to work harder for my business than I am.
That's
But
true.
at this point in my life, now it is, again, that was very much part of like where I was before, where it was kind of like constantly hustle, 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 make as much money as I can because I want to be able to afford dinner. But now I think it has, like, I think given the opportunity, like, to move away from that, like I very much am someone who it would be nice to just be like, here, take all the art that I make and just do something with it, and then give me back enough money for me to survive. Like, I don't want to. It does, because it takes energy and time, and over time, it's felt like more and more draining and exhausting. Like, do I want to be making sales, or do I want to be, walking around barefoot in moss? Like, given the choice,
and
given
I
the
think that,
moss.
and I think that's the idea that I'm trying to present here is the, you know, reconciling the opposites. You know, it's just trying
Mm-hmm.
to, you know, like, to be able to kind of get the best of both worlds. I think that it's possible, you know, and I think with managers and stuff, you really, really have, like, that's something I feel like, just as like a lesson that I've had, is you really, before you say, oh yeah, you're going to be my manager or whatever, like having a deep foundational relationship with that person and really knowing that you can trust that person, because essentially you're like, a manager, for instance, is like some of that you're like in some sort of pseudo marriage with, like business marriage with,
Yeah,
you
I
know.
was I was gonna say, for like gallery representation, I've always compared it to marriage. I'm like, that's a commitment. That's a big commitment. That's like a big financial commitment. It's a commitment for
Mm-hmm.
like the direction that your career is gonna go in. Like, you have to be really sure of that person because you are putting so much onto them, and you're like giving up a lot of control over your business to them. So it is nice to have something off of your plate. And I think for some people, that's like the only option for them because they really don't have the time, or they know that they don't have the skills to do that themselves. But it's a big commitment. It's a lot of, yeah, it's, you really have to be sure about
Yeah.
that
Uh-huh.
relationship.
Yeah. How has your experience been with working with galleries? Like, is it a positive experience in general, or, you know, without like naming names or anything?
Without calling out galleries directly.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's helpful. Sure, I think that's probably helpful for people that listen to this podcast. You know,
Yeah.
just
I mean, I will say I really love the experience of people seeing my art who wouldn't be able to buy it. And I think that's like the one place that galleries will always have in this world, is that it's so great to be able to go and see an artist's work when you can't afford it and you would never be able to see it otherwise. And like getting to meet people who came to see my art is, it's a really great feeling. But also, like, for me, I think just personally, I I prefer selling directly
Yeah.
in general, just because like I can, and you're usually giving up half of your money, like to give up, half of your salary to someone else. It's like it's really got to be worth it. And to me, if I can sell work on my own, that's generally going to be what I'm going to do. But
Makes sense.
I don't ever want to completely stop having exhibits, just because, again, then the only people who can ever see your art again are people who purchase it, which is, I don't know. And it's also, I think, just in general, it's kind of nice sometimes to have a goal, be like, oh, I have an exhibition coming up. Like, let me make a body of work that kind of will all go together.
Mm-hmm.
As someone who very much like doesn't really plan their art at all, it's always just like whatever weird chaos is inside me in that moment. So it's kind of nice to have some kind of like slight structure where you're like, all right, let me think of how these paintings will look together. And it's
Mm.
also a great opportunity to exhibit really big works, which are like, I love making for exhibitions, but they're a lot harder to sell. So it's kind of nice being like, okay, there's a place for all of these big paintings together.
Mm-hmm. That makes sense. Do you have any exhibitions coming up?
No, because I've been focusing on workshops for the last couple of years.
Hmm.
So after I do another workshop this summer, then I'll probably go back to exhibiting. Because I feel like for me,
Yeah.
as like someone who's very introverted, like I can only have so many social things planned in a
Mm-hmm.
year, because then it's like it's
Yeah.
too much.
Yeah, I understand that. Uh, what was this? What was the decision to for you to do these workshops? I mean, is it like what do you enjoy about it?
Well, for me, like the first time I ever did a workshop, like I was so stressed out. I was so nervous. Like I was just constant panic attacks in the days leading up to it. But
Hmm.
then during the workshop, it was like a few days long, and it was in another country, and it was just like everyone bonded so much, and watching people like learn and grow and connect to other artists, and just getting to like help them, and feeling like, oh, I'm actually like, this is something that I love doing and I'm good at, because when I look at people's art, I'm like, okay, I know exactly what you're missing right there. Like, I know exactly what you need to change. And so it was such a satisfying feeling being like, I can go into this and I can connect to these people and we can bond, and watching like my workshop groups as a group, like
Hmm.
get to know each other and like have this little artist community with each other, where they can be like an artist. Every time you put a group of artists together, things get so vulnerable. They open up so much. Everyone's like, here are all my darkest secrets, and here's like the stuff that I can't talk to anyone else about. And it's amazing because it's like, it's such an artist thing where we're all like, oh, we're also like weird and strange. And then you put them together in a group and they can all be weird and strange together. And everyone's like
Yeah.
so like vulnerable, and especially like learning and trying to improve your art in front of other artists is, it's very vulnerable, because you're like learning a new skill, so you're being bad at it in front of other people, which is like such a
Yeah.
vulnerable feeling. And watching, like, to me, like that's such a draw always, anytime I can like experience real vulnerability. Like that's so much of what I make art about, is like really vulnerable moments you don't usually get to see, because I'm like, that's so rare in our society to see like true vulnerability in people.
Hmm.
And so when I can have a workshop where it's like a week of getting to know people and bonding with them and going through really intense experiences, and just like seeing them all open up and be so vulnerable and intimate, and like sharing so much with each other and with me. And it's just like, it's a really incredible experience every time. Like I'm so glad that I've gone to do this, because I really like never could have imagined how, yeah, how, I don't know, the
Hmm.
word transformative is huge, but that's kind of how it feels. Like it's very like transformative experiences every time. And I'm also like so glad that I get to have like little connections with people around the world. Like that's pretty incredible. And I never, like growing
Yeah.
up, ever could have imagined that I would like get to experience that.
Hmm. And I mean, you said the word vulnerable a lot. Like, when do you feel the most vulnerable? I mean, is it like when you're creating art, or like, and because when I think of vulnerability, I also think about how if we listen to certain callings, there can be a lot of growth within that
Mm,
vulnerability. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think, and particularly with the workshops, a lot of vulnerability is like I'm trying to do something new and I know I'm not going to be good at it and I'm going to do that in front of other people. And like for me, like as an artist, like it is hard to do that in front of other people. It's hard to do something that might look bad. It's hard to like, because all of us, we get so caught up in our art that it's really hard to make bad art. It's hard to make art that we don't feel like is fully successful. But as an artist, like I feel very vulnerable when I'm making art, but I also feel like when I'm painting other people, like there's almost a necessity of there being vulnerability on both sides of like both the artist and the model. Recently, like um, I was just being photographed by a photographer. And it was interesting because I was like, I'm on the other side of this. Like, usually I'm the one kind of making the art, and this time it's someone else. But I felt like there wasn't any vulnerability either from that artist or from myself in that moment. And I feel like that comes through in the art. Whereas like when I make art of people, I always try to be like as vulnerable as possible with them in that moment so that they can also be as vulnerable as possible with me. And so that way that art can capture some of that. And I think it requires, and it's something that it's like you can't even put your finger on it. You can't really define it, but I think my best art has always come from both people being like truly vulnerable in that moment, especially because there's so many of my paintings are nudity. Like I think there's a lot of vulnerability inherent in that.
Mm-hmm.
But when both people are like really open to that vulnerability, I think you can make really beautiful art.
Mm. And do you do those paintings live generally?
I have in the past, but usually now I take photos for it because again, with that kind of like, and I think it would also be very interesting to try doing another one live. I definitely will again at some point because that's a different kind of vulnerability. But I think for me, so much of what I want to capture isn't something that sticks around for long enough. And if I'm painting someone, one of the things that I noticed, if I'm painting someone live, like they might be being vulnerable, but then I'm not because I'm painting and I just get completely focused in my art and I'm not there with them. And then it's almost like I've asked them to be vulnerable and then I've just left them alone in the dark. Like, whereas when I'm taking photos, like I always, like if my model is naked, I usually get naked too. Like, we're just going to be in the woods together. We're both going to be naked. We're both going to like wander around. We're going to talk. We're going to bond. Like,
interesting.
Because I don't like the dynamic of like, oh, I'll just sit here as the artist and you get naked, you be vulnerable, but like I am just the observer. It's like, no. I want us to both be on the level here. I want us to like both be in this together, in this like in this moment.
Have you seen that movie Portrait of a Lady on Fire?
No, I don't think I've ever even heard of it.
There's one scene in there that it basically challenges the idea of the gaze, and it's not even speaking about, it's the gaze essentially of what the the person painting and the subject. And if I'm articulating this correctly, the moment is between a woman painting another woman, and the woman that's being painted feels vulnerable, and then they switch seats and shows that that they're actually having a mutual experience in it as opposed to her just being painted. I hope I articulate that correctly if I'm remembering the scene right.
Yeah, I just looked it up. I just Googled it. I'm looking at the images and it looks incredibly beautiful. And I'm like, how have I not heard about this?
I think
like, it looks amazing.
This specifically is a film that you would really like.
Yeah, I'm going to watch this tonight.
Yeah, recently I interviewed this director. Her name's Nina Menkes, and she came out with this film called Brainwash, and it's a documentary about how patriarchy and the male gaze has infiltrated society, but specifically through cinema and mass media. And it breaks down very specific like camera angles and camera movement and how the male gaze is shown through these different like camera techniques, and she gives a lot of evidence to that. But she also brought up that film Portrait of a Lady on Fire and showed how it gives more of a nuanced perspective on who's looking, who's being looked at,
Mm-hmm.
and Portrait of a Lady on Fire is about these two women that are in a relationship or establishing a relationship, and so yeah, I don't know. I think that documentary and that film is really interesting, specifically about what we're talking about. And
Yeah.
something that's interesting too is like I've never thought about that, like being a photographer that also shoots people nude. The exchange or I don't know. I think it's different though too. Like if I were nude with them, it's like I don't know. You know what I mean? That could be a little strange. I think like
It's different if someone walks into your photography studio and you're like stripping down versus if me and my model are in the forest together running around naked. It's definitely a
yeah.
different vibe for sure.
I think it's just different. Yeah, it's different. It's different dynamics. I think that, and especially me being a man too. Like I don't know. You know what I mean? Like,
Yeah.
but just as a topic of an exchange of energy, like I
Well,
haven't thought about that as even a realm in the realm of possibility. So I'm curious, like how you find your subjects.
yeah, well, I think it's just like it's so fascinating to me in general, and I think to a lot of people because it is the subject of a lot of books and movies. Just the relationship between like the artist and the muse, and that dynamic between them. And one that I really liked, it was really messed up, was The Vegetarian, um, which is like a really cool
Mm-hmm.
book. But
Did you say The Vegetarian?
yeah,
Oh, interesting. Hmm.
uh,
What is it about?
it's a story set in Seoul, and it's about this artist and his kind of growing obsession with this woman and his like desire to paint her. And
Hmm.
um yeah, it's a really kind of fun, well, no, fun is definitely not the word to describe the book. It's pretty messed up. But it's this very, I love books where people, they kind of like devolve into this artistic obsession. I think that's such a fascinating topic. And so a
Yeah.
lot of it is kind of around that, this like growing obsession. Um, and I think, yeah, the idea of like how artists connect to their muses, model muse. I always tend to use muse because I think that word, it kind of like encompasses more the fact that they're a part of the painting, they're a part of the process, as opposed to just like the
Yeah.
object that you're painting. But I think like,
That makes sense.
growing up, like kind of going through art school and stuff, you learn so much about the art history, how it was solely dominated by the male gaze. There's so few instances of female artists who had any kind of success or any kind of place in art history, and so much of it was just like the people were just literally objects to be painted to convey various ideas or stories, but it had nothing to do with them as people. I
Mm.
think that might be one of the reasons why people connect so much to paintings like Mona Lisa, where they get some sense that maybe she was something more than just like an object in an allegory, like
Mm.
there's some sense that maybe there was a human behind this, because there's so much like, and particularly like with people of color, it was like, oh, well, there's an object to show images of, like an exotic other world and stuff like that. And women
Mm-hmm.
were, there's so many different kind of ideas placed upon the bodies. And so rarely did they feel like they were actual human beings who the artist had like any kind of connection to. So for me, when I paint, like I just want the person I'm painting to be a bigger part of it than that. I don't want them to just be like, but on the other hand, I paint myself all the time where I want just like, I have an idea and I just want like a body to be like a stand-in for the idea, like I'm just using my own
Mm.
body as like anatomy and proportions and whatever, because I'm like, I don't care about the model in this instance. Like it's all about the idea and the creativity. But when I'm painting other people, it's so different because I want to paint them I want something of them to be inside the painting. And it also puts more pressure on the painting too, because it's what if they don't like the way that they've been represented? That's a real challenge too.
Hmm.
There's a lot of pressure to make sure that you're not misrepresenting them, and that's part of, I think, the vulnerability is that they're putting their image into your hands and they're trusting, and literally too, because they're literally letting you take photos of them,
Hmm.
which is like a lot of vulnerability, that you now have
Yeah.
these photos of them that they like. A lot of my friends, like, that is absolutely not, they're not someone who has a lot of naked photos of them around. So that's like a huge vulnerability that they're placing into my hands. And I feel a lot of responsibility to not abuse their trust and to like handle everything like as gracefully as possible. If that makes sense. Like
Yeah.
make sure that I represent them in ways that they like love and connect to.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, of course that makes sense. Yeah. Yeah. And I'm sure you learn a lot about, um, well, I was going to say, I guess, like, I'd imagine that also can potentially deepen those relationships too, that you both have these shared experiences.
Oh, for sure. Yeah.
Yeah. Of like immense vulnerability. Do you remember the first time that you painted someone in this way where it was you like thought about, I mean, was there like a specific moment where you were like, that kind of shift between from model to muse, that shift from not just seeing someone as the subject to seeing someone as like a real big part of the collaboration, or has that always been something that you've been aware of?
I think I think that for many years, I just in general being someone who's kind of more on the shy and introverted side, who finds it more difficult to like open up with people. I think that there wasn't as much of that in my art, because it was so hard for me to like. Again, I think asking for that vulnerability from the person posing for you, you need to give it in return. And I think I
Mm-hmm.
wasn't capable of doing that for a long time. And so I think maybe the only people that I had that kind of vulnerability in my paintings with was with partners, because they
That
were
makes
people
sense.
that I did have that kind of dynamic already of like intimacy and vulnerability. And I think I'm very lucky that over the years I've kind of been able to, despite my awkwardness and introversion, I've kind of been able to cultivate friendships with people where I was able to open up more, and I was able to kind of get that same intimacy from them in return. And so now I feel
Mm-hmm.
like, I have a lot of friends who I'm kind of like, hey, you want to do a painting? And
Mm-hmm.
they're so open and they're so willing to kind of like help and be a part of that process. But I also think that I'm lucky to have a lot of friends now who are artists, and artist friends make the best. They make such wonderful models because they have their own ideas,
Mm-hmm.
and I definitely experienced that with one of my exes. She was
Mm-hmm.
a photographer and a writer, and so she had such an artistic eye that when I was making paintings of her, it was like I'd be like, well, this is my kind of general idea, and she'd be like, well, what if we did this, and what about this, and we could do this, and I'd be like, wow, that's amazing, it was brilliant, absolutely. So it came so naturally to her to be a part of the artistic process. So artists, they make wonderful models because they're bringing their own ideas into your ideas, and so it feels like so much more of a collaboration.
Yeah. Yeah, that's so cool. Yeah. So uh I kind of want to change gears a little bit. So like I was curious, like you were talking about before when we were on the phone about certain rituals you have around your artwork.
Mm-hmm.
And I think we were talking about like having a collection of bones or something. Is that right?
I do have a lot of bones. I have a very large bone collection. I have
And
like
so
a bone cleaning cage actually in the woods.
a bone cleaning cage, what is that?
Well, because if you want to clean your bones, um,
Okay.
regular problem that a lot of people deal with.
Yeah.
Uh, if you want to clean your bones, then there are a lot of options, but
Mm.
the one that doesn't involve buying beetles or boiling the bones is you can just like leave them outdoors and nature will clean them in the
Hmm.
most beautiful way. So you just need your bones to not get dragged off during that process. So I have a large cage that my brother built for me, and when I find deers, I think I've got like porcupine, a bunch of like about half of a deer, and uh, some other random bits and pieces in
Hmm.
my cage right now. And then, in a year or so, I'll just go and collect them and do any less like little bits of cleaning. But yeah, if someone's ever wandering through the woods and they come across that cage, it's going to be a terrifying experience for them.
so so now I'm curious, like, do you drag these corpses like over to your cage, or like?
I do. It's funny because my parents, the most normal people, the most like
Uh,
just the nicest, most normal, kindest people. And, they're just kind of like, how did we raise this wild, feral creature of a daughter? But being the very nice and supportive parents that they are, they did help me drag back a deer corpse
holy
last
shit!
winter.
Wow.
Got out of a garbage bag, and and every time they find bones, my dad's like, "Oh, I found some deer jaw bones for you, and I left them by the back shelf." And I'm like, "Thanks, Dad. That's great." Like they're
That's
really
wow.
they're
That's
very
some
supportive.
supportive. Yeah, that's some very supportive parents.
Yeah, they're like, I
Um,
don't understand you, but I love you regardless.
so okay, so how did these bones apply to your artwork? Like, is it helpful for you? Like, because I remember we were talking about like essentially like uh, hmm, it's like connecting with that like spirit energy of the animal spirit energy, essentially, or
I feel like to me, everything that's had it like it's something that contained life in it, and so there's like that power inherent in it. It's like this was a part of a living thing, and I think that's part of why I like being in the woods is that like everything there has been a part of like a living thing, and so you're just
mhm.
kind of surrounded by that. But with bones, like I feel like they have so much in them, like it's so they're so close to life, and it's such a thin thread between this was like an alive thing and this is no longer an alive thing. So I think there's a
Mhm.
lot of power in that. And I sometimes, like as part of my art practice, do osteomancy, which is like divination by bones. And
Hmm.
I find that like really helpful for me. Like it's kind of like reading tea leaves, but I'm reading bones instead.
Wait, run me through that process because I have no understanding for how this process works.
So I think people usually call it like throwing the bones. But you basically you have whichever bone, and I like use different selections of bones every time, but I just like, you holding your bones and
Mhm.
then sometimes like I'm asking a specific question or sometimes I'm just looking for like a general idea and then kind of throwing the bones and reading things into them. So the same way that,
Hmm.
yeah, everyone knows like reading tea leaves could be the same thing, but with bones. And I'll do the same thing with tarot cards too. Tarot cards I find really useful for coming up with new ideas. I think I
Hmm.
can't remember if I mentioned last time, but like one like I was doing like kind of a long session where I was like using tarot cards and coming up with ideas and um I had an idea about the card the tower, but it being like
Yeah,
a like pile of like my own head piled on top of my own head, like a
we
pile of
did talk.
them.
We did talk about that. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. So and those kind of ones like
Did
I
you end up painting
definitely
that?
no, I still haven't done it yet. It's I
Hmm.
just got the canvas for it, so I'm like, okay, I'm gonna start soon.
Hmm.
But I also have like my constant problem is I have like 10 painting ideas and I can't do them all.
I mean, that doesn't sound like a problem to me. It
It's the
just
best
sounds like,
problem in the world, but it's so frustrating.
yeah, just constantly taking the time to allow yourself to express these emotions, and at least you have the uh, painting as the art form, like something that you can put all that energy into. Some people don't have that. I feel like not being able to have like a way to express these deeper emotions can be very troubling for people.
Yeah, I know people who, they talk about the difficulty in being like, I don't have that thing that I feel passionate about and I don't know where to put that energy. And I feel like that would be a really hard place to be in, because I feel like my problem is like not having enough energy for all the things that I want to do, because I'm so passionate
Mm-hmm.
about art and I have so many ideas, and it's just like the time and energy, and then the frustration when one doesn't work out, because if I start a painting and it doesn't work out, which just happened the other day, and it's like I spent maybe 3 days working on this painting and it didn't work, and it's that like intense like frustration and anger, and kind of anger at myself, because I'm like, I could have this. I've basically betrayed another idea for this shitty idea that didn't even work, and I could have done a great idea, but instead I didn't. Instead, I wasted my time.
I understand. I mean, that's just kind of the process, I feel like, of finding the diamonds in the rough. You kind of have to like
Yeah.
sift through some dirt.
Oh yeah, and I'm always telling other artists, I'm like, failure is a part of the process. It's like it's not, nothing's gone wrong. It's literally a part of the process. It's an integral part of the process. It's like as much
Yeah.
of a part of the process as the successes are. Like if you're not failing, it's because you're not experimenting enough. But then when I fail, I'm like, this is an affront to my existence. Like, how dare this bad painting exist? How can it be so bad? Like it doesn't even make sense.
If only we could uh, be constantly listening to the advice that we dish out.
I
You know,
know, I know.
it's
That's
such
why
a
sometimes like I like to talk to other artists, because I can just hear myself give them the advice and I'm like, that's great advice. I should really take that.
yeah. Life is a little bit more complicated than constantly being able to give people advice. Like I'm curious, like going back to the tower specifically, because as you know, tarot uh, has been encompassing my psyche as of recently for reasons that I will tell people later. But
Oh, the little like dropping little hints in. I like
I know,
it.
yeah. This is probably the first seed that I've
Little,
dropped on the
little
pod.
teaser.
Yeah, a little teaser for everyone. But what is it specifically about the tower that spoke to you? And are there any other cards that come to mind that have spoken to you recently?
Ooh, well, I went through a long period where I was just drawing the Hermit over and over and over again. When I first
Mm.
like moved to the woods,
Ah,
I was like, "Yep, that tracks. That makes sense. That is where I am right now." And that is, I think, like every time I was pulling it, it was kind of like, "This is where you are right now. It's also where you need to be right now. Like, stop fighting it. Just accept that
yeah.
this is what's right for you right now." And I was like, "Yep." Although for the last year, I've definitely moved away from the Hermit. I haven't been pulling it very much anymore. Um,
Interesting.
yeah, which I think
Yeah.
makes sense. I think that was like very much a strong period in my life where that needed to be the primary focus, was like kind of that recentering and finding myself again, by
That
myself.
makes sense based off of the things that you've told me. Yeah.
Yeah. But the tower is, I mean, I have such I think like a lot of people, the tower is, not a favorite. It's definitely not a favorite. It's not a card I love to pull. And I was doing kind of like a long, I don't know, I guess, yeah, ritual, really, where I was trying to focus on, um, negative's not the right word, but I guess like, yeah, negative energy, negative feelings, negative emotions, like things that bring me like shame or embarrassment or fear. And like being like, okay, that's such a strong feeling. Like the feeling of like shame, like that is such a strong
Yeah.
and powerful like
Yeah.
emotion. And it to me it's like a very negative one, but there's so much power in that. And like, can I use that for good? Could I use that for
Mm,
something more powerful? Could I channel that energy into something that
sure.
is exciting or interesting? Like, can I, because I don't want to see emotions as like bad or good, but instead just like varying levels of degrees of like strength. Like
Hmm.
shame is such a strong emotion, and that's like, how can I find something in that that's really fascinating for me? And so the tower was a card that I was kind of focusing on when it came to like fear, because that's very much like a card that I associate with like fear,
Hmm.
as is definitely one of my fears. And so I was kind of just focusing on like imagery that I was like calling up and like trying to like bring out images. And one of the ones that I had was this like my heads kind of piled upon each other. It's like all of these various failings, all of these like, towers that I had built up and that had collapsed on me, kind of piling up on each other. And, that was like, it felt like to me, like all of my fears, all of these like perceived kind of failings, all these things I was so afraid of them happening. And I guess maybe the kind of more like positive side of that for me would have been like that, all of these things that I was so afraid of that had happened. And yet I'm still here. Like all these bad things happened. And yet here I am. I made it through all of them. So how bad were they really?
Yeah. Well, yeah, I think, when I think of the tower, I think of like a violent upheaval of your reality or the reality that you've constructed for yourself. And it kind of makes sense that from what you've been telling me that potentially that, the Hermit and the tower resonate, because of you moving out to the woods and essentially becoming a hermit in certain ways, and also redefining a way to live for yourself, and not expecting it. Because I think the tower also represents not expecting certain changes, right? And especially if, because of the pandemic and everything, like moving out, to the woods and thinking that you would just be leaving the city for a couple of weeks, I think psychologically that can have certain effects.
Yeah, well, and for me, like the tower has always been so much about like you built this thing up, you constructed this thing. It's like you worked really hard on this. This is like an empire that you've built, and now it's all come crumbling down. And like the pain of like seeing your hard work and all the things that you've done, like you feel like you're losing all of that. And I feel like for me, that partly was like moving to the woods is that I did work really hard to construct like this life and this career in this city. And, even just like working on like building friendships and building like my, kind of social world there. And then kind of feeling like, and now it's all like all of that work is like crumbling down. And I see that sometimes I think too with my career right now in general, that sometimes it does feel like, oh, well, this is like, you're going through a period of like massive change, and a lot of the things that you work so hard on are going to like come crumbling down. But it's never like, for me, that's never a comfortable experience. It's always going to be like deeply uncomfortable. And I think there's a lot of like strength and a lot of power in those moments of like discomfort that I really like. And again, those are like, to me, anything vulnerable, anything like difficult and hard, anything where there's that like intensity of emotion is always going to be fascinating to me. It's something that like I'm always drawn to. So I kind of really love those moments, like, but in the moment itself, it feels like shit. Like it's a horrible experience. Then afterwards, you're like, fascinating.
Totally. Yeah. I mean, I think that there's a lot of catharsis that can be had there, and I think like, yeah, I mean, it's a big shift from being in like isolation as opposed to being in like a burgeoning city where you're really close to like in proximity to all your friends, and also, yeah, that would make sense. And I think that there's going to be a lot of creative insights for you going forward. And I'm like tempted to take out the cards right now and pull, but perhaps
well, it's so funny because I'll just have them beside me and just like randomly pull them throughout the day, where I'm like, I have a thought and I'm kind of like, I'd like feedback on this. And I also like, I have I came up with a bunch of ideas and I haven't really painted any of them yet that I've liked, at least. But I have such a, not super positive relationship with the swords just in general. Like I feel like it's always hard for me with swords. And so I do at some point kind of want to delve more deeply into that, because I think like I have a lot of fears around everything that the swords represent, or not fears necessarily, but Yeah, they're hard for me. Like I fall more easily into the other suits, but swords has always been the hardest one for me. So
Hmm.
at some point I do. I think anything that you feel like disconnected from or like it kind of gets your back up, it's like that's something really interesting to explore.
Totally. Yeah. Yeah. I've been thinking about that a lot too. Um, Certain books or, films or depending on like the subject matter, but certain things that feel very challenging and how those challenges can really help you psychologically to an extent if you just stay there and stay focused on like understanding or trying to figure out like what the text is trying to say to you, or even like the idea of learning a new language and trying to speak to other people in that new language and how that can be like incredibly uncomfortable. But I believe
Mm-hmm.
that listening to those uncomfortabilities can actually, there's a lot of growth there. I mean, you can probably think about it too. Like I know that you study Muay Thai, and I could imagine, your first couple months were just incredibly uncomfortable, but then you just kind of get into a
Mm-hmm.
flow.
The incredibly deep discomfort of doing something that you're really bad at and like knowing how bad you are at it.
Yeah,
It's like
for
and
sure.
just being out of your comfort zone. And I'm very much someone who like the law, like a object at rest stays at rest and an object in motion stays in motion. Like I'm very much someone who like there needs to be that initial push of energy to get me into a new place. And then kind of once
Hmm.
I'm there, it's fine, it's easy, but it's hard to like when I'm at rest, I just want to stay at rest. When I'm in my routine, I just want to stay in my routine.
Yeah,
And so I need that kind of like that external, or I need to like kind of put in the energy to push myself into like a different place, into like a different way of doing things. Because it is like, I feel like that's where you get the most kind of value out of those really uncomfortable experiences. And
totally.
I've never regretted doing things like that. Like I've never regretted those things that made me uncomfortable, whether it was like, traveling or teaching or Muay Thai or anything like that.
Yeah,
But it's hard in the moment. It's difficult and it's exhausting. And
of
yeah,
course.
Muay Thai was physically exhausting and mentally exhausting when I started.
Yeah, totally, totally. Sorry, I'm gonna let this can you hear it in the background?
Yeah, the
The
siren.
siren. Yeah, I'm gonna let that pass real quick. Um, yeah, well, let's see. Yeah, I mean, I feel like we went over a lot of different areas. We talked about tarot. We talked about your bone collection.
I'm so glad my bones came up.
I know, me too. We talked about the muse and a change of lifestyle. Is there anything else that you like to share with people that are listening to the podcast? Just do it, damn it! Just go out there and make the best of yourself. No.
Just go out there, move into the woods, collect a bunch of bones, and
Hmm.
then you're gonna be living a happy life. I'll send you a photo once I finally finish building my cabin and decorate it with bones.
Oh, are you really gonna do that?
Yeah, I'm planning on having them all hanging from the ceiling, but I also want to have
Wow,
some
sick.
hanging in the woods nearby so that if someone does happen to like stumble across my cabin, they're confronted with skulls hanging from the trees. They're like, you know what? I'm not going to rob this cabin. This cabin is scary. I don't want to go near it.
It reminds me of like Predator or something. Like using human heads for like to. Uh, I mean, well, yeah, you're probably not gonna use human heads, but
I mean, I certainly wouldn't admit it on a podcast if I was.
yeah, yeah. I was thinking, what's funny is when we had that bone conversation, I was like, if someone starts a podcast here, they'll probably think you're a serial killer having your your bone den or whatever you called it.
My bone den. That's a great name for my cabin.
The bone
The
den.
bone
Yeah,
den,
well,
yeah.
it's yours if you want it. So
Okay, thanks. I'll keep
yeah,
that.
yeah. But yeah, is there anything else that you like to share with the audience?
No, I don't think so. I feel like we covered a lot of diverse topics.
Yes, we did. We did. I loved it. Yeah. Um, well, cool. It's always such a joy to talk to you. And you're, more than welcome to come back on the podcast for any reason. So, yeah.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. It was so much fun. It's always really interesting conversations.
I completely agree. Yeah, I appreciate you for doing this.
Yeah, thanks so much.
Music for the podcast is by Rarebit, aka Justin Dosher Hopkins. YouTube and creative support is by Tyler Scully. Social media assistance is by Noah Wainwright. Thanks so much for tuning in, and see you next time.